Wallis Budge's The Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians continues. Chapter 4, The Egyptians at Work and Play. We may now briefly consider what steps the Egyptians took in order to obtain the greatest benefit from the Nile flood. Long before it arrived, every town and village contributed its number of men to clear out the main and subsidiary canals and to heap up dikes which would serve not only to confine the water within safe bounds, but would also serve as highways during the inundation, on which men and beasts could travel from place to place. In many places, the banks of the Nile had to be strengthened, and embankments thrown up in certain parts of Upper Egypt, where the distance between the river and the mountains was considerable. Large basins to catch and hold the waters of the flood as they rushed northwards had to be constructed. These basins were sometimes more than 1 mile long. Their width varied according to the width of the riverbank. Their sides were thick, solid, sloping embankments from 12 to 20 feet high, and openings were left in their southern ends. When the flood waters caught in them were at their greatest height, the openings were blocked up, and each basin thus contained a vast quantity of water, which would be available for irrigation purposes after the flood had subsided. When needed on the neighboring ground, it was let out by degrees, and when the basin was nearly empty, grain was sown in the shallow water, and the crop from it grew up and matured without further watering. The bottom of the basin was covered with a layer of the rich, fertile mud that was brought down into the Nile from the mountains and forests of Abyssinia by the Blue Nile and the Atbara. The soil of Egypt is composed of this mud deposit, and it is to the thin layer of mud that is added to it annually during the inundation that it owes its fertility. The Nile is now depositing mud on its bed at the rate of nearly 4 inches in a century. The thickness of the mud soil of Egypt Zakazik in the delta is about 110 feet. Muhammad Ali introduced a system of perennial irrigation into the delta, and now the basin system is practically abolished. The area of Egypt is about 12,000 square miles, but the area of cultivatable land has always varied with the annual inundation. It increases during a high Nile and decreased during a low one. The land covered by the Nile deposit was about 7,250,000 acres, but since the building of the Aswan Dam, 2 million more acres has been irrigated. The dam is built across the valley at the head of the first cataract, north of Fila. The valley is 2,185 yards wide. The dam holds up the water to the level of 348 feet above sea level, and its storage capacity is estimated at 37,612,000,000 cubic feet. It is filled during the months December to February, and the water is discharged during the months of May, June, and July. Below low and high Nile, the river rises 26 feet. From what has been said above, it will be seen that the most important work to be done in ancient Egypt was in connection with agriculture, and it seems very probable that the bulk of the population was employed in it. The king's officials watched over the irrigation of the royal estates. The priests safeguarded the interests of the temples, are what they consider to be the houses of the gods. The governor of each of the 42 nomes or districts into which Egypt was divided took care that all the public works in connection with the river were properly done, and the peasant farmer made ready his plots with anxious care. Could that be why there's 42 oaths? Is that 42 districts? So they wanted 42 I have not statements. the Book of the Dead and all that. And in every case, the slave did most of the work. Most of the seed was sown whilst the water of the Nile flood was several inches deep, and needed no further attention, and that which was sown in the soft mud was generally trodden in by goats. When it was necessary to break up light land, the hoe was used. Heavy land required a plough, which was drawn by oxen. In reaping, the cutting instrument was used. The ma, the and it, the lemid of the Hebrew system kind of looks like that too. And this took the place of the flint knives of early times. The threshing of the grain was done by oxen on a threshing floor somewhat of that shape. And the shape is also kind of like a hill, you can use that to represent a hill, can't you? The preparation of the soil intended for certain crops was carefully studied, and the merits of top dressing were well understood. At the present day, the dust from the ruins of ancient and ruined buildings is eagerly sought for by natives to lay on their fields, and it is most probable that modern Egyptians are merely following in the steps of their ancestors. The principal crops were wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, vetches, lupins, clover, flax, cotton, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and papyrus. In certain parts of Egypt, where there was an abundant water supply, there were large vegetable gardens in which most of the vegetables known to the modern Egyptians and beloved by them were grown. In all periods, the Egyptian has eaten largely of vegetables, and, as mentioned, is made in the medical papyri of tinctures and extracts and oils of certain plants. It is clear that the physic garden was not unknown. The physic garden was not unknown to the Egyptians, and that a large number of plants were grown because they were believed to possess medicinal properties. Even at the present day, in the purely native markets of Egypt, there will be found an old man or woman squatting on the ground with a series of little bowls laid out before him, containing the dried seeds and leaves of a large number of medicinal plants and woods. With these are various kinds of powders, lead, antimony, and copper, and grease for the eyes, and proportions of the dried bodies of crocodiles and other reptiles, which are which are supposed to possess emetic, purgative, and aphrodisiac properties. Avoid contact with lead and antimony that contains lead. Well, not all antimony, but antimony that contains lead. Copper and some of the grease. Copper is something you have to be careful about to a degree, and grease depends on the grease. But medicine often includes a lot of toxic things, doesn't it? Arboriculture, in our sense of the word, did not exist in Egypt, and exotic trees were only to be found in royal gardens or in the gardens attached to the temples of great entities like Yemen-Ra at Thebes. Under the 18th dynasty, certain trees were brought to Egypt from southern Arabia and Punt in western Asia and planted in the palace grounds at Thebes, but the Egyptians generally preferred to grow trees from which they obtained some solid advantage. The principal trees known to the ancient Egyptians were the thorny acacia, in Egyptian Shunj, the date palm, Bernur, the doom palm, which flourished best in the southern part of Upper Egypt, the sycamore, the pomegranate, 2 or 3 species of tamarisks, the mulberry, the carob, Christ thorn in Egyptian, nubs, the persea, the fig tree, and the oil tree. So long as the waters of the Nile flood covered the land, the irrigation of the fields and gardens was comparatively easy, for the water flowed into every channel prepared for it, even to the edge of the desert. But when the land had come forth, i.e., when all the water had run off from it, the watering of the fields and gardens became a very serious matter. The Egyptians had no pumps and no mechanical help for watering purposes, and every gallon of water required had literally to be lifted up out of the river and poured upon the land. As the river fell, the lift became longer, and the work became harder, especially in Upper Egypt, where the Nile banks are very high. In a painting on the wall of the tomb of the 18th dynasty, we see a man drawing water from a hole in the riverbank into which the water of the river had flowed. The skin bucket was attached by a cord to the thin end of a heavy long pole, which worked on a pivot in two stout posts driven into the top of the bank. To fill his bucket with water, the man drew down the thin end of the pole, and when he had filled it, he allowed the end to rise, and the heavy end of it, acting as a weight, lifted up the bucket of water until it reached the level of the channel in the side of the bank. When he tilted out the water in it into the channel, the water ran on to the plot to be irrigated. This kind of water-raising machine had been in use for thousands of years in Egypt, and the shaduf, which the modern Egyptians use, closely resembles it. The heavy end of the long pole is now often made heavier by plastering it with several hundred weights of Nile mud, especially when the river is very low and greater leverage is required. When the Nile bank is very high, it is often necessary to construct a second shaduf halfway down the bank, and two men are required to work each shaduf. Whether the ancient Egyptians knew of the water wheel, similar to the modern Zakia, is uncertain, but it is very probable that they had somewhat similar water-raising contrivances. In the Zakia, an endless rope passes over the wheel, and to this is attached a series of earthenware pots, arranged at regular intervals, which, as the wheel revolves, dip into a pool fed by the river at the bottom of the cutting of the bank and become full. When they reach the trough on the top of the bank, they empty themselves, one after the other, into it. The wheel is made to turn by means of a cogwheel arrangement, which is kept in motion by an ox or ass, a donkey, or a camel, or even by a man's wives. The care of the livestock on the estates of the king and the temples and the nobles was also a very important work, and provided occupation for a large number of peasants and slaves all over the country. The breeding and rearing of cattle were well understood by the Egyptians, and the paintings in the tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms attest to the importance that was attached by noblemen to the possession of large herds of cattle. One painting even tells us the numbers of the cattle which an official of the 5th dynasty possessed: 834 oxen, 220 cows and calves, 760 donkeys, 2,234 goats, and 674 sheep. Under the Old Kingdom, two kinds of sheep were known. These the sheep with spreading horns, which was the symbol of the entity Knem, and was worshipped by the people of the first cataract, and the sheep with the horns curled by the side of its head, which was a symbol of Yemen, or Yemen Ra. The bull, because of its strength and fertility, was worshipped at a very early period, and kings were proud to be called the mighty bull, trampler on his enemies. Now, if you remember the sun bull and the moon bull stuff, Hammurabi, because his law was the one, was it the sun bull? It was like, oh, you worship the sun bull, but I worship the moon bull, so I don't consider your statements of religious authority, but I honor your political authority. was it I think it was the Sun Bull and the other guy the Moon Bull, or he was the Moon Bull and the other guy worshipped the Sun Bull, but that sort of thing. Even at the present time, many an African king is addressed as mighty bull, bull of bulls. The bull was slaughtered and offered as a sacrifice to the entities. The ox did much of the hauling and transport on the farms, and the cow, that was good milker, was treasured, for the Africans love milk, particularly the northeast corner there. Other parts of Africa, not so much, because they can't really digest it. When you go sub-Saharan, goats, which are often counted with the sheep, are kept in large numbers, and the pig was tolerably common. The donkey was bred on all large farms for transport purposes. It, like the pig, was probably eaten by the slaves and swamp dwellers. Now, a note on sacrifice is that a true God wouldn't need all the sacrifices. It may ask it for our own evoking of ourselves, to prove that we will sacrifice and have that dedication. But the herdsmen belonged to the slave and peasant classes, and were probably, as in many parts of Africa at the present day, mentally or physically deficient. Attached to every herd was an official who watched the feeding of the cattle, and who understood how to treat them medically and how to administer baluses, and to prescribe special kinds of food when necessary. The greatest care was taken of cows and sheep that were young, and according to Diodorus, sheep lambed twice a year. Herdsmen were skilled in the domestication of wild animals and birds, which were brought to the farms by hunters and fowlers. Among the animals represented are the ibex, the gazelle, the oryx, the antelope, and among birds, the pigeon, the heron, the crane, the duck, the goose. Goose farms existed in many parts of Egypt, and one district, Chenoboskia, derived its name from the goose pens, from which it was famous. Beekeeping was common. For honey, betnu was used in making a kind of mead and in medicine, and in later times for embalming the dead, and wax was valuable for making amulets and figures of the four sons of Horus, and the models of men and animals that were burnt during the performance of magical ceremonies. It was sometimes used in mummifying the dead, and in ancient times in Persia, mummies were always made with wax. The word mummy means a body that has been treated with wax, though it is often applied to bodies that have been preserved with bitumen. The sign B that appears in the royal title Betit is commonly regarded as B. Afaf. Okay. Afaf is the fly, or the honey fly. Afsayat. Yeah. Afsayat. But it probably represents a wasp or hornet. As keepers of poultry, the Egyptians won the admiration of classical writers, and Diodorus says that they used to hatch out large numbers of birds by an artificial process, i.e. by the use of the incubator, which did away with the necessity of the mother birds sitting on their eggs. On this matter, the inscriptions tell us nothing. The artisan class formed a comparatively small part of the population of ancient Egypt, and the most important handicrafts were those of the potter. The pre-dynastic Egyptians succeeded in making very graceful pottery without the help of the wheel, the use of which does not seem to become general until the dynastic period. The earliest known colored pottery is usually red and black, but this was preceded by the bowls and pots in monochrome. The art of burnishing was known as the black, red, and parti-colored vessels testify. The buff-colored, unburnished pottery is frequently decorated with designs in red in which human beings, animals of the antelope class, ostriches, boats with and without sails, mountains, and water are represented. All these vary in size and frequently in shape, and it is quite clear that the potter made no attempt to standardize his work, and that the size and shape of the vessels depended upon the quality, the available quantity of material, and his individual fancy. Some of the pots made during the early period appear to be copies of stone vessels. Under the Old Kingdom, many funerary vessels were made of polished red ware, and this reappears in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. The potter often copied the shapes of the vessels from Western Asia and elsewhere. I keep forgetting to look up the Greek to get that right. Maik, Lamaik, Ptolemaic, perhaps. That makes most sense at the moment. The black ware bowls and vessels ornamented with linear designs inlaid with lime, which are often seen in collections belonging to the Hyksos period, and the false-necked vases, commonly known as bugle cannon, were imported into Egypt from Greece. A considerable amount of Nubian pottery found its way into Egypt under the Middle Kingdom, and the finest examples of what may be called eggshell pottery were made on the island of Meroe in the Sudan. The Egyptian potter usually confined himself to making the vessels that were the most needed in everyday life: bowls, saucers, flasks for oil and unguents, large wine jars, oil jars, water jars like the modern zir, and huge amphora and vessels in which to store grain. Unlike the Greek, he rarely attempted to invent new forms and shapes, but from first to last was content to follow native custom. He made vessels to be useful, not ornamental, and most variations in their shape or decoration were due to foreign influence. A good idea of the general character of Egyptian pottery may be obtained by examining the fine collection exhibited in the 6th Egyptian Room of the British Museum. Here we found specimens of all periods, from about 3500 BCE to the Meroitic period. The brickmaker, while there was function and there was also information conveyed, and yeah, it wasn't art for art's sake. The brickmaker, the manufacturer of bricks, gave employment to a great number of slaves and others for almost every building in Egypt, with the exception of the temple, which was of stone, was made of unbaked bricks. The muddy soil of Egypt was particularly suitable for brickmaking, for it was free from stones and could easily be mixed with water, and kneaded with the hands into a paste of the necessary consistency. A mass of paste was thrust into a wooden mold of the size of the brick required, and the top of it smoothed with a flat stick, and when the brick was dry enough to take out of the mold, it was laid in a row, with others on the ground to dry in the sun. In a day or two, it was ready for use. Bricks varied in size from 10 to 15 inches in length, from 4.5 to 7.5 inches in width, and from 5 to 6 inches in thickness. Some of the bricks made under the New Kingdom have greater dimensions. Many bricks have, like those of Babylonia, a king's name stamped upon them, and some have thought that such were made by the king's brickmakers for sale to the public. Burnt or kiln-baked bricks are not common in Egypt, owing to the scarcity of wood or other material for burning. The products of the looms of Egypt have been made famous throughout the world from the earliest times, and linen, cotton, and woolen fabrics must have formed very important items in her export trade. The stalks of flax were soaked in water until the rind became loose. When they were taken out and dried and beaten with mallets on stone slabs, the outer covering of the stalk was made into lamp wicks, and inner fibers were combined with iron hooks and made into yarn, which before being woven into cloth was wetted and beaten with a stone. The greatest care was taken to clean the flax fibers by heckling them with a large wooden comb. The yarn was spun by hand, and both the women and the men were adepts in the use of the spindle, which was usually made of wood and had a head made of some heavier material. Two sorts of looms were known, the upright and the horizontal. Linen cloth was calendered by means of wooden rods rubbed over it, and to smooth garments after washing, they were rubbed and pressed with a wooden tool which closely resembles a plasterer's wall smoother. Then, as now, linen apparel was worn by those who could afford it, or preferred it to wool and cotton, but the swathings of mummies were always made of linen. Under the New Kingdom, the city of Apu, the modern Akhmim, in Upper Egypt, was famous for its textiles, and the Coptic linen weavers today perpetuate its ancient reputation. The linen of Pelusium was almost famous, and Signor Limbroso believes that the French word blouse is derived from the name of that city. Cotton was grown in Upper Egypt, and cotton garments were worn by all classes of people, but it seems that large quantities of cotton were imported into Egypt from the districts near the river Khabur in exchange for linen fabrics. The weaving of garments made of wool obtained among the peasant classes, but the pieces of woolen cloth that have been found in the tombs prove that officials and even priests sometimes wore such. The carpenter and joiner, the handicraft of working in wood, was a very general one, and though little wood was grown in Egypt, the carpenter readily found employment. Though there were no wooden floors, no wooden window frames, and sashes in the houses, and the furniture was scanty in most of them, the Egyptians found the carpenter a necessity in almost all their trades. The woods principally used by him were the sycamore fig, from which he made coffins, doors, large tables, funerary coffers, etc., the acacia or tamarisk, which on account of its close grain and hardness he used for masts of boats, weapons, articles of furniture, etc., ebony imported in logs from the Sudan, and used for making or inlaying ornamental boxes for the toilet, jewel cabinets, etc., and cedar, imported from the Lebanon in large quantities and used for the making of great barges of the entities. Tough woods obtained from the trees in the deserts, and various kinds of deal, thought to have been important from southern Europe, were also used. The art of veneering was known, and inlaying with ivory or glazed porcelain was commonly practiced. Also a species of dovetailing by means of wooden pegs driven through the mitred parts of the sides and ends of boxes. The method of closing coffins and sarcophagi by inserting tongues of wood into slots in the cover, and the coffin and driving pegs through them, was found to be very effective. The pre-dynastic carpenter used a saw and a chopper made of flint. The former was a long flat slice of flint with a beautifully serrated edge, and the latter had a handle, something like looked more like a butcher's knife because you got the, you know. Later, both these tools were made of copper or bronze. Other large tools were the axe, with the wedge into it, and an adze, to the forepart of which was attached by leather thongs a sort of flat chisel made of copper. The former was used for splitting wood, and the latter for smoothing it, thus in a way serving as a plane. Holes for pegs were made with a borer, and slotting work was done with a mallet and chisel. This mallet was different in shape from that used by the stonemason. The plane was unknown and was practically unnecessary, for wood surfaces were smoothed by rubbing with stones. The drill was used in working hard woods and was worked with a cord. The metal worker. The principal metals known to the Egyptians were gold, that bangle thing, dub, silver, nub hetch, i.e. white gold, electron, cham. Oh, silver's shown by this triangle and this diamond thing attached to the thing, and the dots are on the side. Electron doesn't have the bangle thing. It has like a square with this thing, and oh, one of the dots is dark. Oh, Cham, is what is electron, is a mixture of gold and silver, or perhaps pale gold from the Sudan. Copper, Hempt, just the horn and the dots. Iron, Ya, lead, Jat, and tin. Told you Menwub Tran. Oh, tin is that's tin. Hut is lead. Okay. Gold was brought from the Sudan and from parts of the east coast of Africa and from the eastern desert. Like honey and wax, it was supposed to possess some special but undefined property, and the blood of the sun entity was thought to be made of gold. Several qualities of gold were distinguished, the finest and purest being called Kayith Yima. It was worked into ornaments in the earliest times, and under the Middle and New Kingdoms very large quantities were used. The mummies of some of the kings were placed in thick gold sheaths, and the funerary vessels, bowls, cups, saucers of kings like Thutmose III were made of solid gold as specimens of massive goldwork. The jewelry from Dahshur and the vessels found in the coffins of Queen Hatep may be mentioned. Alluvial gold came chiefly from the Sudan. Gold in the form of rings came from Somaliland and perhaps also from Arabia and Asia. Silver was known to the Neolithic Egyptians, and few other ornaments made of it have been found. There's also that impact glass from during the time of Thutmose, that kind of greenish, little yellow, greenish yellow sort of color. But there's not a lot of materials, they're obviously not going to cover them all.